Hello everyone! The first thing we are going to do in this part of the tutorial is to create two functions which will take care of the visual activation and deactivation of the drone, which means changing the material and switching the emitters and sound on and off. Let's start with deactivate drone. First, let's deactivate all the particle systems. So get reference to all of them and call the deactivate node. Next would be to fade out the sound of the drone. For that, we are going to use fade out, set the duration to 1.5 and the volume to 0.0. And the last thing is to switch out the material. To that, you may be tempted to just switch out the material we added previously to the skeleton mesh, which would be just replacing an element in an array, but this won't work. Even could lead to crashing the client or the server, depending where the logic is executed. But regardless, let's try it and see what will happen. Most of the time, we need an instance of the material, and to get one, we need to use a node for that, which is called create dynamic material instance. Let's now move to the activate drone function. We're going just to copy paste everything from the deactivate to the activate and make some small changes. Replace the deactivate node with the activate one. And change fade out with fade in. As a last thing, we are just going to switch the material. Let's do a quick test. For that, we are going back to the drone terminal. And right after we summon the drone, we are going to call the deactivate function, which should turn off all the particle systems, the sound, as well as change the material, which shouldn't work, by the way. And then after a small delay, like 5 seconds, we are going to call the activate drone function and turn everything back on. And here is the tricky part. If we test this as a single player without a dedicated server, this will work. As you can see, the particle systems were deactivated and activated after 5 seconds. But if we test this as a dedicated server, see that nothing changed. To make this work on a dedicated server, we need to make use of multicasting. So let's do that. We're going to create a custom event inside our SpyDrone blueprint, and I'm going to name it MC deactivate, MC standing for multicast. I highly recommend to use prefixes for the event names, like MC for multicast, ROS for run on server, or ROC for run on client. And the only thing we are going to do here is call the function itself. So MC deactivate will call deactivate drone, and we repeat that for the activate. So create another custom event and call activate drone from it. Now let's go back to the terminal and replace the functions with the multicast events, and always make sure that the multicast events are called from the server side for them to work as intended. When a multicast event is called by a server, the logic inside is executed on the server as well as on all nearby clients. And since our changes are only visual changes, we want that part to only run on the client. And to do so, we are going to use SwitchNet Authority. And let's also fix the material. To change the material, we are going to use the set material node found under rendering material. And we need to do the same in the activate drone function. Double check everything. And now with the dedicated server, and we see that the activate worked, but the deactivate didn't. The reason for that is simple. We are calling the deactivate right after we summon the drone, and since the summoning was done on the dedicated server, it didn't exist on the client when we called MC deactivate. We can solve this by just adding a small delay in between summoning the drone and calling MC deactivate. But let's do this the proper way and make the drone deactivated by default. Open the components section of the drone blueprint. Select all the particle systems and just uncheck auto activate. This will make sure that the particle systems are by default deactivated, so when we summon the drone. Do the same for the audio, and we are done. Now let's move our focus to the terminal. One of the remaining things to do here is to create and set the destroyed mesh. So let's do that. In Unreal, this is pretty easy. Just right-click on a mesh and choose Create Destructible Mesh. But before we do that, we need to prepare a few things. One of them being that the materials used by the static mesh can be used on a skeleton mesh. To check that, let's open the material itself, find the usage section, and make sure that used with skeleton mesh is checked. And we need to do that with all the materials used by the mesh. If it's a material instance with a parent, we can do that by just overriding that property from inside the instance. And once we have done that, we can now go right click on our mesh and choose Create Destructible Mesh. And if we forgot any of the materials, we'll see an error message popping out, notifying us about the material not being usable with a skeleton mesh. Fix that. And we got ourselves a destroyed terminal. Now just reference it inside the terminal itself. Now it's time to add a menu to our terminal. So make sure that our terminal has Blueprint Multiuse and Tries enabled, so we can change the menu items from inside the blueprint. The next step is to implement the function pp get multiuse and tries, which is responsible for getting the list of menu items that the user will see. Create a local variable. Inside, we will store the initial items and later add our custom items to it. And to make sure that we always return the list, regardless if we add something to it or not, I'm going to use the sequence node. So the first thing would be us manipulating that list, and then the second is just returning the final list to the user. This way, even if we have some unconnected nodes in the first step, we are sure that the second step will be executed. Now let's create a new multi-use and try and add it to the list. For the use index, make sure you are using a big enough number so you are not using something which is already used by the core game. The menu item will show access terminal as an option. And we want this menu item to be enabled, disabled, depending on if our terminal is activated, powered, or deactivated, unpowered. To do so, we're just going to check container activated. If it's activated, the menu item won't be disabled. If it's not activated, the menu item will be disabled. and we want also to change the color depending if the item is disabled or not. A side tip, you can hide all these options you are not going to change so they don't confuse you by just unchecking them. For making a color, I'm going to use make slate color, as I like to have a visual representation of the color itself. And we are done with adding a new menu item. Now let's define what will happen if the user selects that menu item. To do that, we need to implement the BP try multi-use function. Make sure you have the return value checked, or you may block some of the default menu items. Again, let's make use of a sequence node to have it better organized. Now let's check what the use index is. Is it the number we defined for a menu item? If so, we want to execute our logic. If not, we are just going to return true and that's it. And the logic we want to execute is simple. We just want to add a buff to the player. For that, we are going to use static add buff, feed it the player controller, but we don't have a buff yet. Let's fix that and create our own buff. Just right click where you want your buff to be and choose a new blueprint. And as a parent, pick primal buff, rename it, and reference it inside the static add buff. And we are done with this part of the tutorial. See you in the next one.